And this week, our recent theme of culture war bizarro turnabout continues, with yet more tales of conservatives encouraging an illiberal, my guest might even say authoritarian, approach to higher education. That guest is famed Harvard University psychologist Steven Pinker, whom Quillette readers and podcast listeners will know as a stalwart defender of classical liberal values and scholarly freedom against the encroachments of so-called woke campus culture warriors. Yet Pinker himself is deeply concerned by the Trump administration's recent strong-arm efforts to force Harvard to become a less progressive institution, including by denying Harvard the right to enroll foreign students and receive federal government research contracts. Trump administration officials are even insisting that they have the right to scrutinize the details of Harvard's academic offerings before they will relieve such restrictions. Steven expressed his concerns about the federal government's actions in a lengthy May 23 New York Times essay entitled Harvard Derangement Syndrome, and he joined me this week on the Quillette Podcast to talk about it. Professor Pinker, thank you for joining the Quillette Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so this is an unusual situation because if I were interviewing you just a couple of years ago, it would be about the latest progressive illiberal outrage in the Ivy League, and we'd be both be agreeing about, those nasty illiberal progressive extremists. Why can't they just accommodate diversities of opinion? Now the shoe's on the other foot. But before we get started with the current situation, a lot of your piece in the New York Times, which I discussed in the introduction, is about establishing the fact that you, of all people, are more than aware of the problem that these heavy-handed federal government gestures are meant to address. You start off by saying that you are the author of a 2014 essay that was literally called The Trouble with Harvard.
Yes.
This is 11 years ago, which I realize is 300 years in culture war time. But in those primordial days, what was the trouble with Harvard?
Then the primary focus was on Harvard's mysterious and opaque admissions policy, they called holistic admissions. I could not have anticipated that it would have become famous in a Supreme Court case because, kind of as I predicted, it was basically used as a massive way to discriminate against Asian American applicants. But it favored, it's not just racial preferences, but it favored children of alumni, big donors, athletes, musicians, activists. And I somewhat mischievously said, well, why don't we daydream and imagine that there'd be some way of admitting students that would not require upper middle class parents to go in a frenzy of social activities for their adolescent to burnish their teenager's CV. They got to sort clothes for the homeless. They got to gather petitions.
They climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and then played a cello performance for their Sherpas.
Stuff like that, yes. Said, imagine there was some way of just, we've got this institution that's devoted to the acquisition and transmission of knowledge. It's got libraries and labs and collections and expensive star faculty. There's some reason to try to match that resource with the students best able to take advantage of it, namely students who are intellectually curious, intellectually accomplished, smart. Why don't we, it wouldn't be great if there was a magic wand that would allow us to select those students. I said, well, we kind of do have this magic wand. It's called standardized testing. That's why it was introduced. And so I called for Harvard to change its mystical, holistic admissions policy, now deemed to be unconstitutional, with a transparent, meritocratic admissions procedure, not ruling out the possibility of adding some underrepresented minorities to the mix for various purposes, but at least to be transparent and not to hide everything in this holistic mysticism. So that was the trouble with Harvard. I mentioned other things, the fact that an elite education in the United States now is kind of a luxury cruise where academics are just one pastime. And the student, I can see this in my own classes. I'm a pretty well-known professor, and my classes, I think are pretty entertaining. I have, videos, I have jokes, I sing, I dance, and my lecture hall is half empty within 2 or 3 weeks of the semester. Why? Where are all those students who are paying through the nose to be able to hear my lectures at Harvard? It's not that they're slackers. They got more important things to do, like sing in the choir and pull an oar on the crew, or do stand-up comedy, or write for the student paper, or network in various other student groups. Harvard College kind of encourages it.
Are they watching the lectures online?
No. I don't make them available online for exactly that reason.
They're just skipping class.
They're cutting class. Yeah, I want there to be fannies in the seats. Anyway, the university does not consistently spread the message that, don't cut class. That's why you're here. That's why we have these expensive professors and labs and libraries and collections. Anyway, that was the trouble with Harvard. Anyway, all of this is, as you know, this is ways in which I, at the outset of this article, but just more generally, tried to establish my credibility, as I'm not a shill for Harvard by any means. I have been out front in criticizing it, starting with that article, but also the article that the Boston Globe called Steven Pinker's 5-point plan for Harvard to save itself, where the 5 points were committing to academic freedom, to institutional neutrality, to non-violence or non-coercion. That is, protests can spread ideas, but they can't try to jawbone the university to do what
occupying libraries and smashing things,
forcibly removing deans from their offices, drowning out lectures with bullhorns.
And what year was this?
The end of 2023. And the university has actually, I don't want to say they followed my advice, I mean, they may have done it anyway, but they did implement a policy of institutional neutrality. Of course, Harvard being Harvard, we can't actually admit that we used an idea from someplace else.
In 2014, when you wrote The Trouble with Harvard, you were pretty much going directly against the prevailing cultural trends. 2023, by contrast, you were riding the crest of the cultural zeitgeist, not knowing that just a year or two later, it would overtake you.
Yes, right.
It would overtake you at the federal level. Take me back to the Steven Pinker of 2023. Did he realize that the forces that he was promoting would be extrapolated in this radical way?
No, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition, as they say in Monty Python's Flying Circus. Yeah, the idea, not only was at the time Joe Biden was president.
It was a simpler time.
It always was. Times just get more and more complicated, don't they? Yeah, I know. I did not. And the way that the Trump administration is, frankly, in an authoritarian manner, wants to take over universities, which is pretty much what the April 11th ultimatum issued to Harvard would do. Namely, among other things, a government-approved panel would audit every unit of the university for viewpoint diversity by their lights, and have the power to stack every unit with a critical mass of viewpoint diverse scholars undefined.
Did you have colleagues come up to you and say, "Happy, Stephen? Is this what you wanted?"
Did I enable that?
Yeah.
That hasn't happened. People may have thought it. The problem being that there are a large number of people who, I think, agreed with me, and that's not because I persuaded them. They were thinking that all along. And there are, some colleagues even now who are saying, well, Harvard wouldn't change without the threat from the Trump administration.
Necessary evil to spur reform.
Yeah. But the thing is that it's, what he's doing, if he leads to the expulsion of a quarter of our student body, namely those not born in the United States with visas, if he strangles all federal funding of research, if he includes other punishments such as removing the university's tax-exempt status and multiplying the tax on its endowment, this would have massive effects on the university. There would not be solutions to any of these problems.
Harvard is obviously a name-brand university, but there are dozens of fantastic research universities across the United States. Is it the case that he's sort of focused closely on Harvard simply because it's pick of the litter, and places like Boston University and Tufts and University of Virginia are just strolling merrily along without federal government interference of the type Harvard is getting?
Absolutely.
As Canadians, we're familiar with tall poppy syndrome, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to raise your head above the others because then you get chopped. But if you're a kind of excellent university that isn't Harvard, maybe you're kind of putting out the word like maybe you, I don't know, for all I know, you're getting calls, come to
Yeah.
come to Penn or something like that.
Well, what has happened just in the last few days since our foreign students were threatened is that one university in Hong Kong and one in Germany have said to the students, we'll give you asylum. But some of the punishment that Trump has been levying against Harvard has been levied against all universities, such as the massive cuts in funding for research, the massive cut in direct costs, the tax on university endowments is going to hurt all universities, although Harvard is being singled out.
Yeah, well, their endowment is off the charts.
Although the endowment can't be used to underwrite cancer research. For one thing, 80% of it is earmarked for specific purposes bequeathed by the donor, and a lot of the endowment income is used to pay for scholarships for students who can't afford Harvard's tuition. We have need-blind admissions, and there really isn't enough to cover the support of research. Also, there's a massive misconception that somehow the federal government is just supporting Harvard. It's not. It's paying for research projects, and if it doesn't pay for them, they don't get done.
If I'm playing devil's advocate here, you're a person on the street, and they're saying, wait a sec, you're charging students, what, $60,000, $70,000 a year to go to Harvard? You have tens of thousands of students here? Pay for your own research. Why is the federal government in the business of giving a single cent to an institution whose main product goes to let the pampered sons and daughters of upper middle class suburbanites spend 4 years on a sun-dappled paradise, skipping your lectures?
Yeah.
Or fire the administrators. You've written.
Yes, well, they should do that. Although it's not enough. But the thing is that why should for the person in the street, why should the federal government give money to Harvard? Is that money is paying for the research on Alzheimer's and cancer and Parkinson's and infectious disease and energy and so on. It's like saying, why should General Motors is a big corporation? Why should the federal government have to pay for cars? Or why should it pay for a wealthy highway contractor? Well, because we're providing a fee for service. We have to compete for those grants anyway. And if someone has a better proposal from the University of Wisconsin, they'll get the grant instead of Harvard.
I get the sense a lot of this comes back to that infamous moment when you had the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and I think it was MIT,
Yes,
that appeared before it was a congressional committee where they gave these really tortured, pre-prepared responses to questions about anti-Semitism on campus in the aftermath of the Hamas terrorist attacks and the Israeli military reprisals that followed. Two of those presidents are since gone, including Harvard's. How much of this is related to the anti-university sentiment that took root in that moment, and universities became strangely associated with bigotry?
I think a fair amount. That our former president Claudine Gay was almost a perfect storm in many people's eyes of everything that's gone wrong in the university. I like her very much. She's a colleague, and I've had good relationships with her. But she was appointed as president on a very thin scholarly record, one that probably would not have earned her tenure. She was Harvard's first African American president, second female president. I was kind of proud of that, but the question is, did that go into her selection? And the answer is probably. The fact that she was then exposed as having had a track record, a number of incidents of pretty minor plagiarism, but still something that we don't tolerate in our students. And then that tone-deaf testimony in Congress when she was asked if students called for genocide against the Jews, would that violate Harvard's...
I got the sense all that was written by the general counsel.
Yes. The response, it depends on the context. Yes, well, it was, or at least a law firm that had been hired to coach her. Now, there were multiple failures there. Obviously, she was badly coached, as we know now.
But she's the boss. I mean, she's the boss.
She's the boss. That's exactly right. She's the boss, and she did not have the kind of leadership of a university, part of which is representing the university on the public stage, including an ability to think on your feet, including some sensitivity to the sensibilities of the population. And part of the problem with that testimony is simply that, even if she was literally correct, the First Amendment does protect people calling for genocide, and Harvard is committed to the First Amendment. But still, just some bristling, some raised eyebrows, that would be horrendous. That would be shocking. We would make it clear in no uncertain terms that this is abhorrent. But the First Amendment protects even abhorrent speech. Blah blah blah.
She gave a bureaucratic response.
And part of it is also she is the boss, but the law firm has some blame, and the corporation, that is our board of trustees, that told the law firm to advise her.
Yeah, well, corporations don't appear before congressional panels. Human beings do. This piece you wrote in New York Times, which is very good, although I have to say, in the course of setting the baseline and establishing credentials as somebody who is cognizant of all the reasons people have a backlash against Harvard, you recite examples that I'd forgotten about. And in rereading them, I was like, oh my God. Quote here, the epidemiologist Tyler Vanderweel was forced to grovel in, quote, restorative justice sessions when someone discovered that he had co-signed an amicus brief in the 2015 Supreme Court case arguing against same-sex marriage. I mean, Barack Obama was elected his first term. He was an opponent of gay marriage. Last I checked, he didn't have to grovel for restorative justice.
Right. I mean, that was a spectacular failure that we did not have the dean of the School of Public Health say he can say what he wants. He doesn't have to apologize for it. This is not a crisis as it was treated at the time, and for the president to echo.
Or this one, the legal scholar Ronald Sullivan was dismissed as faculty dean of a residential house when his legal representation of Harvey Weinstein made students feel, quote, unsafe. Last time I checked, everyone has a constitutional right to a fair trial, including competent legal representation. You go on and talk about how Harvard is not the sum of these viral woke stories. And that part resonated with me. I've spoken with Canadian scholars, and our universities are more quote unquote woke than even Harvard. And they've said to me, and these are sometimes conservatives, they say, look, 95% of my colleagues just want to study their subject of expertise. They don't want to bother with politics. They don't want to sign petitions about Gaza. They don't want to go to pronoun sensitivity training, but they also don't want to sign petitions protesting pronoun sensitivity training. They just want to do their work, which is the reason they got into academia. It sounds like Harvard's kind of similar to that.
That is exactly right. Perfectly put.
But we hear about the other 5% of the people making the news.
That is right. Now, one could say that it doesn't take that many people being punished for there to be a regime.
Especially if they're occupying the library and telling Jews they can't use certain areas unless they pass checkpoints and stuff.
Yes, that's right.
You only need a dozen thugs behaving like that to make 20,000 people feel that their university's been taken over by radicals.
No, that's right. And if what happened to Tyler Vanderweel, Ron Sullivan and Carol Hooven could put a chill on everyone else, it's like, well, I better keep my head down. I don't want that to happen to me. But it is true that you can get the impression from hearing these stories that is the regime, that there's a well understood policy that you don't cross the line, and they were the ones who did cross it. It isn't. That's not the way it works. The way it works is I gave a long list of politically incorrect findings that my colleagues have published and teach, including myself.
You're the worst offender. You're on this podcast. I mean, you're totally unrepentant.
I've published in Quillette, yes, but there's some caprice in what incidents trip a wire, go viral, bring hellfire down on the head of the person. So, Carol Hooven.
Sure. A Quillette author. She's written for Quillette about chess, of all things. Why
do some incidents become outrageous and others pass beneath the radar? That is the reality. Now, and there is the danger that if there's some low probability of cancellation, that puts a chill on everyone else. And who knows what hasn't been published out of fear.
It becomes a kind of lottery.
It's kind of a lottery, yes.
So I asked you, are there progressive colleagues who've taken you to task for maybe encouraging this backlash against Harvard, do you have conservative colleagues or media contacts who, since the publication of this piece, has said, hey, what are you doing? We finally got some action from the federal government on this Michigas that's taken over the Ivy League. And here you are saying, oh, hey, what's going on? Hands off Harvard. Have you gotten heat from the other side?
I haven't gotten heat in the sense of people saying you shouldn't have written it, or probably because I went out of the way to be so balanced. But people have said that, namely, my article's fine and good, but still, if it wasn't for the Trump ultimatum, Harvard wouldn't have moved in this direction.
Columbia is even a better example than this, because Columbia was a place where you actually had this ongoing circus of people physically taking over facilities and stuff like that. And in recent months, Columbia has developed some backbone, clearly related at least to federal government pressure. But this is an ongoing debate. We just published a piece, worked at an institute affiliated with University of Austin.
Oh, yes.
Anti-woke university devoted to free speech. And she was kicked out, largely, she argues, because she had expressed middle-of-the-road views on DEI instead of embracing the full-throated, strident denunciation of anything to do with DEI, which is the favored in-house approach at the university. In my podcast interview with her, we discussed this tension between movement conservatives who oppose progressive illiberalism because it was progressive, and people like you and me who maybe oppose progressive illiberalism because it was illiberal. And that coalition between movement conservatives and disaffected classical liberals is breaking down now that Trump is the president, because conservatives are like, perfect, this is exactly what we want. And people like you and me are whining, no, you're going too far. We were hoping for a more nuanced approach, and breaking that coalition down. Do you sense that? 5 years ago, Christopher Rufo came on this podcast and he was a fellow traveler. Now I look at what Christopher Rufo is doing. For those who don't know his name, he advised Ron DeSantis, for instance, on the heavy-handed strictures they put on higher education there. Stuff he says leaves me quite alienated. Are you sensing a breakdown in some of the intellectual partnerships that you've developed over the last decade?
Yes. And you and I have the same reaction.
Well, that's why you're on the podcast.
That's right. Because we think alike.
I'm intolerant of other views.
Yes. No, exactly. And one of the reasons that I withdrew from the advisory board at the University of Austin, which I thought was a great idea.
And still has many great people affiliated with it. We're not here to slam.
No, that's right. But I think it was going in the direction of becoming a kind of university of unwoke with a faculty of the canceled. I think they're weak in science. I think they've hired far too many people simply because they were either victims of or are assailants of wokeness. And that itself is not the way you pursue excellence.
It becomes an island of castaways.
An island of castaways. I'm going to be speaking at a conference in a few days at the University of Buckingham. Well, I'm going to make the point that a coherent view for the future of academia, intellectual life, governance, and so on can't just be unwokeness or anti-wokeness. There has to be a positive vision. And because, as you put it, the anti-woke forces can be as repressive if their agenda is simply, we're going to shut down the speech that we don't like.
Yeah. Well, you have a great line in your article about the psychological phenomenon known as splitting.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a common phenomenon, but I was ashamed that I hadn't heard of the term, where you say, there's two types of people in the world: people who recognize that Israel is a settler, genocide, colonial state, and people who don't. Or if you're a Trump supporter, there are two types of people in the world. There's people who love freedom and people who hate freedom. And I love freedom and making America great again. And so you're on the other side. And we saw this with racism, anti-racist. You're either a racist or an anti-racist. But from what I can tell, you're starting to see this with DEI. You're either full-throated opponent of DEI, maybe a dominant view at University of Austin. And if you're not an opponent of DEI in every shape and form, you want to eradicate it root and branch, then you're part of the problem. And it's amazing how political movements inevitably find their kulak, the person who's the pivot point for all of the evils of society. And it's a dangerous way of thinking, isn't it?
So true. Even DEI, which I think has done a lot of damage. But on the other hand, one of the remedies for anti-Semitism on campus that everyone recognizes is, well, students should be welcomed into a community in which it's emphasized that disagreements can be expressed respectfully, that there are certain rights that all our students have, that all of us belong to this community.
That's DEI.
Yeah, that's kind of what
That's DEI.
That's what it ought to be. That's what it could be. And, I know our chief DEI officer at Harvard, and she's no longer that. They renamed her position. Perfectly nice person, and I'm sure she could pivot to that just fine.
Final question, and because I know you have to go. If you're like me, right now you're at this strange point intellectually because you still have this antenna up for illiberal progressivism, and you call it out. But part of you is like, should I be doing this when there's this threat to intellectual freedom from the other side of the spectrum? And maybe I'm doing my own splitting. I'm saying you can only do one. I can only walk or chew gum. And if I call out wokeness, I'm walking, whereas I should be chewing gum by calling out Trumpian illiberalism. Like, do you have that conflict?
It may be the other way around, that if we pretend that there are no problems, then we've just handed over the game to the most repressive side, to the Trump administration, just trying to crush the universities with the approval of large segments of the population who aren't necessarily MAGA fanatics, but say, well, look, the universities aren't going to heal themselves. There's no one within their walls who even sees a problem. So nothing short of a wrecking ball from the outside can reform it. I think it's all the more important to say, yeah, there really are some problems, but the way to solve it is not, as I put it somewhat melodramatically, to cut the university's carotid and watch it bleed out.
Yeah, that's unsettling image. I'd like to see what's on your Netflix account after using an analogy like that. New York Times gave you a ton of space. Like, this is a really long piece.
It's a really long piece. They solicited it, and they gave me the space they felt.
But their eyes must have lit up when you said, "Oh yeah, I'll do it. I'll write this piece defending Harvard." I mean, like, this is kind of a win-win for. I've been on both sides of this as an editor. Oh, we're getting the devil to slam hell. Like, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I don't even know if they knew that that's what they would end up with, because they gave me the invitation months ago, and I said, can we wait until the semester's over? I'm in the classroom, I'm on committees, I'm writing other things. And they said, sure, take your time. And of course, all of this unfolded in between the time they solicited the article and the time that I wrote the first draft. So actually, I pivoted in a way just because the assault on Harvard became so extreme. And in fact, I may have pivoted too far in that the first draft, they said, this is too much of an apology for Harvard.
Oh my God. New York Times urging its writers to slam Harvard. What is going on with the world?
Well, in a way, not to slam, but they said, it's not credible in the sense that if things are okay, why did you have to form this Council on Academic Freedom? And so I didn't have to change my mind about anything. It was just a question of emphasis, weight, balance. But I did get more specific about some of the problems.
Did they give you a word count? Because if they did, I'm guessing you blew right through it.
They gave me a word count. I exceeded it by about 10%, but it was a generous word count in the first place. And you're right, it's unusual. I've written for the Times before. For the magazine, you can get away with much longer articles. The editorial page, generally not. But so this was unusually generous, yes.
Okay, a great piece. For those listeners and viewers interested in reading it, it is by unabashed Harvard apologist Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard University. And it has the admittedly excellent title, hats off to the New York Times copy editors, Harvard Derangement Syndrome.
I take credit for the title. Hats off to them for letting me have it.
Oh, wow. I was giving you a compliment without even knowing it. That's how smooth I am. Thank you so much for being on the Quillette Podcast.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, John.